He was apparently inspired by this scene from The Shining. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of the Red Rum Killer. Viewer discretion is advised. This was 41-year-old Stanley Detweiler, and he lived in Reading, Pennsylvania at the time this case occurred. He was living in an apartment that he shared with a roommate. So the night before this case occurred, Stanley's roommate named David, he had met a 16-year-old named Michael Boatland, and David gave Michael the address where he lived. So apparently they met at a bar, and then David was bragging that he and his roommate had a lot of money and that they had this really nice, fancy new stereo. And so Michael told his 22-year-old friend named John Calvaresi about this, and the two hatched a plan. They were going to rob this apartment that David lived in. It was July 25th, 1987. It was the middle of the night, or at least at some point in the night, where both Stanley and David were asleep in their own bedrooms. And suddenly, their apartment door had been kicked in. 41-year-old Stanley Detweiler was awoken by this loud noise and went out to the living area to see what was going on. It was then he was confronted by two men who he did not know. 16-year-old Michael Boatland and 22-year-old John Calvaresi. The two men then began to attack Stanley Detweiler, punching him, kicking him. He fell to the ground. He managed to get to the apartment door where he was about halfway out the door when he was dragged back in by the two men. John Calvaresi then goes into the apartment, takes a knife, and begins to stab Stanley. They had sliced his neck. While John was basically committing the murder, Michael was grabbing just whatever little things he could take. They got out of that apartment with no money and no stereo. But he did manage to grab a checkbook, which does not sound like it was ever able to be used. Oh, and before they left, John Calvaresi decided to behead Stanley Detweiler. He cut his head off. Then, with Stanley's blood, he took his finger and he wrote the word Red Rum on the wall, which is, as most of you probably know, is murder spelled backwards. Made famous by the 1980 film The Shining, where the little boy in that movie says Red Rum, and writes it on the wall. Apparently the movie had aired on television a couple of days prior to this, and John had seen it. He was inspired by it. It didn't take long. They were able to discover who the attackers were, and so John Calvaresi was arrested, as was Michael Boatland. At his trial, John Calvaresi was very flippant about what happened, didn't seem to care, doesn't seem to have any remorse, and just very coldly tells, the court what he did. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Michael Boatland will also go on trial, and he too was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. John Calvaresi dies in prison in 2016 of natural causes. As for Michael Boatland, well, there was a recent development in his case too. A relatively recent Supreme Court ruling, and this was with regards to the fact that minors who were sentenced to life in prison without parole, well, it's deemed unconstitutional because of their age at the time of the killing, because he was 16, and that they now, because of this new ruling, have to get the option for parole. And so Michael Boatland was resentenced to 40 years in prison with the option for parole, which in 2019 was when this happened for him. He would be eligible for parole after about 10 years. People close to him would say, well, that's just not fair. 10 years is a long time. Just to be happy that he gets to live, I can think of someone who doesn't get to live. Perhaps his family thinks it's unfair that he doesn't get a life, right? He was there. He helped. He knew what was going on. Fuck him.